Is it working? Are we streaming? All right, welcome everyone. What's that? Yeah, so Josh Merlo is going to be giving us a talk tonight. This is the second talk that he's given here, and I think the first talk was very interesting, and this one's going to be on where science meets faith. Where science meets faith. For those of you who don't know, Josh is finishing up his PhD in philosophy at the University of Buffalo, and he's also one of our fearless leaders here, both organizationally and faith-wise. So we want to welcome Josh, and first thank him for doing what he's doing here. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Also, hello to everyone who's streaming. I'm going to be very honest with you. There was going to be a very pretty PowerPoint to go along with this talk, and I was in a meeting earlier today that I thought would last an hour, and it lasted 3 hours instead. So no PowerPoint. My apologies for that. I'll try and be engaging rather than just lecturing at you for half an hour or so. So as Mike said, the talk tonight, the presentation tonight, is about the intersection between faith and religion. For those of you who remember, a few decades ago now, I think at least two, maybe closer to three, there was a papal encyclical released by John Paul II entitled Fides et Ratio, translated Faith and Reason. And sort of the beginning of this talk were some considerations, some thoughts that I was having about that connection in really contemporary discussions, specifically discussions about the role of evolution in, we'll call it, the education system at large. I don't know how many of you saw it, but a few years ago there was a debate that was on, I think, PBS between Bill Nye the Science Guy, and then Ken Ham, a well-known creationist who runs the Ark Encounter down, I think, in the South. I think it might be in Kentucky, but I'm not positive. So this debate was specifically about evolution. Ken Ham is a young Earth creationist, meaning he believes that the Earth is a few thousand years old and was created in the exact way it was described in Genesis, so day after day after day after day up until the seventh day. Bill Nye is not a young Earth creationist. Nye is going to argue for a more, I'd call it an atheistic picture of evolution, but that's a little bit unfair to his position. He's arguing for a Darwinian position, which does not involve God creating the world in 6 or 7 days. My interest in this, though, and why you have the talk that I'm giving tonight, is more so about the after effects of that and what prompted Nye to debate Ham in the first place. There are multiple policy initiatives right now in the United States of America to either remove the teaching of evolution from public schools, or to present creationism, Ham's version of creationism, literal biblical creationism, as scientific, as call it co-equal to evolution. This is something that's happening today. This isn't Galileo being on trial 400 years ago. This is still an issue that we have to grapple with. So the Newman Center, I think, is especially well positioned for this. Our faith community directly across the street from one of the foremost state universities in New York, if not in the United States itself. So we have an obligation then, a duty then, to try and figure out what the right relationship is between faith and reason so as to safeguard that in our wider society. I'd like to begin tonight with a simple quote. It'll be familiar to many of you, even though it's going to be in a different language. Quid est veritas? For those of you who know something about Latin, you'll recognize veritas as one of the forms of the word we translate into English as truth. For those of you less familiar with Latin, you know this phrase, just again translated. It's from John's Gospel, the passage read every single Good Friday. And Pilate asked Jesus, "What is truth?" And that's what I'd like to begin with tonight. Because whether we're discussing religion and the beliefs that come with religion, or whether we're discussing science and the beliefs that come with a scientific mindset, we're ultimately talking about what is true and what is not. So to answer Pilate's question, which I think is a very genuine question to Jesus, what is truth? I promise I'm not going to give the entire class that I dedicate in my Intro to Philosophy course to this question, but to briefly summarize, and by class I mean a full week, so it's a lot of summary that's happening right now. Truth is what happens when we say something, we think something, we believe something, and the world is in agreement with, or more properly, what we say, what we think, what we believe is in agreement with the world itself, with reality. So if I were to tell you that I believe right now there are lights on in the Newman Center, we could test that belief against, we call it the state of affairs in philosophy, against the reality of what's happening in the Newman Center. That's a good belief. It's a belief in what we call a true proposition, a claim about the world. That is, if I say there are lights on in the Newman Center, and there are lights on in the Newman Center, I've said something true. And ignoring all the fancy language and epistemology, that's the philosophical study of knowledge and belief, ignoring a bunch of claims that we might make about how these different categories work, at its heart, truth is simply, did you say something that's in the real world or that isn't in the real world? And what's interesting about truth is that we often don't think about it outside of these higher, more abstract conversations that we might have as a religious community or as something that I want to call a more philosophical community. That is, science doesn't normally insert itself into conversations of truth. But I'd like to poke at that a little bit. One of my favorite movies is the third installment of the Indiana Jones franchise, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. And in it, our titular hero is teaching a class, much like he does in Raiders of the Lost Ark. The two movies are very much related. So he's teaching a class, and when we have the cutaway from the heroic things he was doing previously, in his class he's writing on the chalkboard. Archaeology, Harrison Ford says, is the search for fact, he underlines it, not truth. If it's truth you're interested in, Dr. Tyree's philosophy class is just down the hall. So Jones is a scientist. He's a terrible scientist and an archaeologist, but he's a scientist nonetheless. And he says, I'm interested in fact, not in truth. And I think this is a fairly common distinction that we might introduce. That is to say, there are things science deals with, the empirical, the observable, the concrete. And then there are things dealt with outside the sciences, by theologians, by philosophers, and those things have to do with truth. I think Indiana Jones was wrong here. I don't think that's a good distinction. Why? Well, because regardless of whether we want to divide questions that we might have between empirical and non-empirical, that is, things that we can see and taste and touch and hear and smell, and things that we can't do those things for, we might want to divide things out that way. Here's what we can sense and observe. Here's what we cannot sense and observe. Ultimately, we're still talking about the same aims when we divide out empirical sciences from non-empirical endeavors of reason. What I mean by that, the scientist cares about the world as it is. Whether we call this fact, whether we call this truth, whether we call this justified belief, whatever term we assign to the scientist's endeavors, the point of doing science is to find out how the world is. Remember our definition of truth? Truth, in technical terms, correspondence with reality. Does the world look like the way you said it does? If it does, you said something true. If not, you said something false. Science cares about truth. There's not this divide between, well, the empirical studies of the world, they're dealing with facts, like Indiana says. And then you have over here people dealing with truth, the higher questions. Nope. When it comes to aim, when it comes to purpose, scientists and philosophers and theologians and whoever else we might want to throw in there, they're all doing the same kind of work. That is, they're all aiming at discovering what the world is like, discovering what's going on in this thing that we inhabit and we move in throughout our lives. The distinction that we should in fact, make between religious belief and scientific belief, between the study of the empirical and non-empirical, is instead a distinction based on method and based on content and based on authority. While religion and science both try and get at the truth, they do that in different ways. That's the difference, or the distinction, I should say, between methods. In science, you get a beaker and you put the beaker over some heat and you watch what happens and you do some measurements. In religion, we go and read a commentary on the Bible, or at least you would do so in a Christian tradition. If you're Jewish, you would go read the rabbinical commentaries on the Torah. We go and listen to someone who has some experience of God in the world. That's the whole point of preaching. Sure, it's explanation of a holy text, but it's also an expounding upon religious experience. William James, American pragmatist, famously writes an entire book on religious experience, what it means to feel the presence of God. So this personal experience is central to religiosity, different than what we're doing in a scientific laboratory. But both methods are still trying to get us to truth. We can also distinguish between religious questions and scientific questions with respect to content. That is, when you ask how many angels can fit on the head of a pin, that's merely an example. I'm not saying all theologians only do that kind of work. When you ask that question, you're not asking about, well, how many protons are in a beryllium atom? You're asking two different kinds of questions. You're looking at two different parts of reality, so to speak. So there's a distinction based on content. Lastly, there's a distinction based on authority, and that's what we're going to focus on tonight. That is to say, when the Pope says something, when the Bible says something, these are religious authorities. These are binding for the religious audience. Catholics should listen to the Pope. Christians in general should listen to the teachings of Jesus as found in sacred scriptures. Scientists don't, or at least shouldn't, operate like that. Newton, brilliant scientist, also may have had lead poisoning, which altered his brain, also did a lot of alchemy. We don't talk about that in the classroom in 4th grade. Regardless, did some pretty important stuff with, physics and calculus. Very important aside here. Because I study him and I love him, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz independently developed the calculus of infinitesimals at the same time as Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton was a member of the Royal Academy for the Sciences and had Leibniz's work suppressed and said Leibniz plagiarized him. Not true. It's a besmirching of a great, very intelligent, important person. This has nothing to do with my talk, but I get very upset when Leibniz is ignored by the historians of science. Okay, back to the actual talk. Newton, brilliant person, gives us the laws of Newton, which in many ways capture the mechanical operation of the universe at its most fundamental portion. Science doesn't care about authority. Newton's paradigm was overthrown by another name you may have heard of, Albert Einstein. Now, that's a little bit hand-wavy. I'm dealing with this at very broad levels. Newtonian physics still holds in several contexts. It's only when you get to very, very big things and very, very small things that we talk about Einsteinian relativity and then also quantum mechanics. The point is, you had a figure, he did good scientific work, and then another figure came along and did good scientific work, and we added that to the tradition of science. We modified what we previously believed. In science, authority doesn't count for much if you have data that say something different than the authority. Again, it's a simplification of a fairly complex methodology, but the point is here, there are differences when it comes to how religion treats authority and how science treats authority. So these distinctions we've been talking about, I think all but one of them end up being unimportant when we want to question whether there is really a conflict between religion and between science. We already talked about how both are aiming at getting truth, so that's not really a disagreement. With respect to method, yeah, there's a difference between the scientific method and then between sitting down and writing a commentary on the Song of Songs, like say an Origen or a Thomas Aquinas did, but this is resolvable. I came up with what I'm calling the apartment model earlier today. It's genius, I promise you. let's say you're living with 3 other roommates, so you're in a quad apartment. You probably have a shared living space, and then you each have your own separate rooms. When you're doing your own thing, you go to your room, and then you also come out into the shared living space and do things together. I think we can import this model into our discussions of religion and science. There are some things where religion's in its own room and science is in its own room, and then they also come together in a common area sometimes. Now, we're going to have to clarify when they're in the common space and when they're in their own rooms, but the point is, we don't have to say because the methodologies are different, they never can get along. There's absolutely no intercourse. No, just because the methods are different doesn't mean and those methods are irreconcilable. What about the content being different? Well, let's go back to the apartment model. Sometimes you have one roommate vacuum the common room because he has a vacuum, and you have another roommate do the dishes because he actually bought soap and sponges. Sometimes different individuals are better at different things. If we were doing economics, we'd call this opportunity cost. So we look at which discipline does the thing better that we're interested in. Theologians have resources that scientists don't have. Philosophers have resources theologians and scientists don't have. Scientists have resources theologians and philosophers don't have. So we let the person who has the resources that allows her to do better with the particular question we're interested in deal with that question. This doesn't seem like an actual conflict. There's no battling going on here. If we allow for each discipline to do what it does best, unhindered, there shouldn't really be a conflict. But that last distinction, the differences in how authority is approached, this one seems a little harder to explain away. I pulled a few more scriptural quotations out. One of them is from a passage in the book of Job. It's after Job has finally went to God and asked him, "Why have you inflicted so much suffering upon me?" God is not one we would expect. God says, "Shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? He that reproveth God, let him answer it." And then God questions Job, "Were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? Can you command the waters in the sky to be taken up to the sky or to come down? Can you grab the Leviathan by a hook in his mouth and drag him up from the depths?" God's point, you're not me, Job, so you don't get to ask the questions of why I do what I do. That's authority, in this case, divine authority. Science doesn't have a booming voice coming from the sky telling the scientist, "You should listen to me." Or if there are voices in science like that, they ought to be challenged. Another quote, actually going back to the Good Friday Gospel. "So Pilate said to him, 'Do you not speak to me? Do you not know I have the power to release you, and I have the power to crucify you?' And Jesus answered him, 'You have no power over me if it had not been given to you from above.'" Again, it's a question of authority. Pilate may have temporal authority as the Roman governor, but Jesus reminds him that authority ultimately comes from God. And then lastly, from Thomas's Summa Theologiae, although the argument from authority based on human reason is the weakest, the argument from authority based on divine revelation is the strongest. And I think that last quotation best expresses that distinction between what the scientist and what the theologian are doing with respect to how they approach authority. For the scientist, nothing is sacrosanct. If the data tell us otherwise than what we've believed for the last 10, 20, 100, 500 years, in the case of Aristotelian physics, which we'll get to, over 1,000 years, we change the paradigm. For the religious person, though, we don't just get to change the paradigm, change interpretation of Scripture, change interpretation of papal encyclicals or general councils based on one person with a beaker out somewhere. So it's this question of authority then that I want to focus on for the remainder of the night. Who gets to be the arbiter of truth? That is, who gets to determine what is true and what is false? If the disagreement between the scientist and the theologian ultimately is one over who has authority to recognize or to label true and false claims, we should ask then, who should we be listening to? If it's the church, we have to recognize that the church is the arbiter of claims that just happen to be more important. Ultimate questions and their answers, religious questions and their answers, moral questions and their answers. If we say these are the most important claims, well, then it seems like the church is the roommate with the right tools to deal with our problems, so to speak. But if we also care about empirical realities, if you want to figure out whether or not the bridge you're walking on is going to collapse if too much snow falls on it, that seems to be something better suited for the scientist. That seems to be a case in which we allow the scientist to determine what is true and what is false. So this disagreement then, it happens because we recognize there are, in fact, some things science does better and some things that religion or the church does better. And if we have these two competing claims for authority, we need some way to weigh them out. Now, it would be very simple just to say, let the scientist do sciencey stuff and let the theologian do theologically stuff. That's a word. But unfortunately, the simplest answer here misses some important things. Do we want to concede the church's authority is limited to questions of morality? Do we want to expand the church's authority to include any question about reality? Aren't there some propositions or claims that the church speaks on that are in fact empirical in the realm of the sciences? Aren't there in fact some propositions, some claims that are non-empirical, that science has something to say about? Claims that fall into the realm of the church or the philosopher. Isn't there a duty for the scientist, for the theologian, to challenge the encroachment of another discipline into her proper space? Doesn't the theologian need to remind the scientist when the scientist starts speaking about theology? And doesn't the scientist need to remind the theologian when the theologian starts speaking about science to stay put in where they're best able to make comment? The historical examples that we're going to look at momentarily are going to be examples of when we see one version of this encroachment. And hopefully they're going to help us better understand why it is we need to separate out this power of recognizing the true and the false into these two different camps, of why it matters who gets to arbitrate the true and the false. We're going to look at truths properly scientific. We're looking at these not just for historical instances of encroaching upon the scientific discipline's proper space, but rather because of that duty I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk. If you care about creationism not being taught in public schools, if you care about Catholics not being perceived as religious fundamentalists who can only read the Bible and are unable to function in the world outside of what their readings tell them, if you care about the Catholic Church being taken seriously for its accomplishments in the secular realm, Gregor Mendel, friar. Isaac Newton, devoted Christian, although he was called a heretic for his Socinianism, but we'll ignore that. Isaac Newton, or excuse me, I already said him. Leibniz, my good friend, a Lutheran. I can keep running through historical examples. There was a priest who worked on the Big Bang Theory. If we look back at modern science, René Descartes says he does his work of trying to reconcile with the skepticism of his day the new sciences so that he can protect those new sciences, and also his Catholic faith. It's a story, so we're not exactly sure if it happened, but some historians argue that Descartes said one of his motivations for doing this work in the sciences that he tried to reconcile with religion, that he tried to bolster against skepticism, was because he had a vision of the Blessed Mother in which she instructed him to try and bring back the Catholic Church's intellectual tradition, so to speak. That's not an atheistic scientist. If you care about there being figures like Descartes, like Leibniz, like Mendel, like Boyle, I can keep listing off names, then you should care about us being able to separate out what a religious person says from what a scientific person says, so that those persons who hold there are proper spaces for the disciplines to comment are going to be able to say, yes, here's a place where the religious person can in fact say something, because we can take the religious person seriously for engaging with empirical problems, for allowing for a role of the sciences in what was previously regarded as merely a realm of the church's authority. So we're talking about failings with respect to the church exercising authority in the world, because that points us toward how the church should be exercising her authority. We're looking at conflicts in the relationship between religion and science because they give us a good idea of what a right relationship between religion and science is. This is just to point out for you that at the end of the talk we'll get to something more optimistic, something more cheery with respect for bringing religion and science together. But first, 4 case studies of the conflict between religion and science. The first, Giordano Bruno, a Dominican friar. He was executed by the Inquisition in Rome after having been excommunicated and investigated by both the Venetian and the Roman Inquisitions. Bruno was burned at the stake for the sin of saying the universe had infinite worlds in it, and those worlds had life on them, and some of those worlds had intelligent life on them. Bruno was executed by the church for saying there were aliens out there. Imagine what would have happened if Bellarmine had seen the X-Files. Bruno is executed because he challenged the authority of the church, specifically because he challenged the church's sole ability to interpret Scripture and to put forward an overarching system of natural science that was said to be based on Scripture. This system, Aristotelian science, we'll get into a little bit when we talk about our next figure, Galileo. What's important to note, though, is Bruno was seen as overstepping the bounds of science. He went out of his apartment room when he wasn't supposed to. Why? Because Bruno's interpretation of Copernican heliocentrism, of Copernicus's writings, required him to say things that were seen as denying particular parts of the Genesis story, required him to say things that went against the popularized Aristotelian model of the world, technically the Ptolemaic model of the world. Again, we'll talk about that with Galileo. But because the church held on her authority as a teaching church, that Aristotle was right about how the world was built, and also that Scripture required you to believe in the Genesis creation story being literal, Bruno was killed because he suggested that neither of those claims were accurate. But enough teasing our discussion of Galileo. He is probably the most famous scientific figure who comes up with respect to this conflict between religion and science. He's also probably the most familiar figure in any debate that occurs about reason and faith broadly understood. Everyone mentions the Galileo story. So what is the Galileo story? It doesn't start with Galileo. Bruno, actually, did much of the same work that Galileo did, but significantly earlier than Galileo. Our story begins with 2 thinkers, Nicholas Copernicus and Nicholas de Cusa. Copernicus publishes a work in which he argues that there is a revolution of the planets about the sun. We might find this strange. What else would they revolve around? The Ptolemaic model that I mentioned earlier from the Greek Ptolemy, which was later on adopted by the Greek philosopher, natural scientist, bunch of other things, Aristotle, gave us this picture of the world. Earth, and then above the Earth, revolving concentric circles of space that carried with them the planets, the sun, the stars, the celestial bodies they were called. Everything that existed was built into this limited, finite space. And at the center of everything was our home planet, the Earth. Copernicus challenges this model that had went unchallenged for hundreds, if not thousands, of years, and argues that based on available scientific data, which was meager at this point, and a few mathematical principles, geometric principles to be specific, we should understand that the celestial bodies do not all orbit around the Earth, that the Earth itself actually revolves around the sun. Now, there's still some scientific inaccuracies in Copernicus's model, but the point is, historians of science, philosophers of science will actually talk about a Copernican revolution. It's the changing of our understanding of the universe, of the cosmos, from being centered on us, that's the geocentric model of the ancient Greeks, to our merely being a small part of a wider cosmos that was not centered on us. That's the Copernican model, hence the Copernican revolution. We went from thinking we were the apex of creation and the center of everything that existed to not being that. I also mentioned Nicholas de Cusa. He's a mathematician and also a natural scientist. Worth mentioning because he is probably our first Renaissance into, call it age of science or Enlightenment thinker, that period of time. He's likely the first person who proposes that the universe is in fact infinite. This is what's going to be drawn upon by figures like Bruno and then later on by figures like Galileo. This is the start of the battle over heliocentrism, in which Galileo is merely a player, but he is the most recognized of all the players for us today. Galileo argues that the Copernican model, which had been challenged following its publication, is in fact correct. Some of the challenges to Copernicus's heliocentric model came from within the church, in the same way that Bruno was challenged. Some of them came from within the scientific community. Tycho Brahe, one of actually the last great astronomer who did not have the benefit of having a telescope. Again, we can't be anachronistic here. It's very easy to say past thinkers were idiots. How well would you have done without a telescope and observing the stars up in the sky? So Brahe, like Copernicus, they don't have telescopes, but Brahe again does some fairly complicated, fairly advanced mathematical work to challenge the Copernican model. He argues for what I'll call a modified geocentrism. The Earth still has stuff revolve around it, but not the whole universe. So Brahe is challenging based on rigorous observation, the Copernican model. It's not just religious pushback, and it's important we understand that. So Galileo's not just fighting a battle with church authorities, he's also fighting a battle with the great scientists of his day. Brahe first, and then later on, we'll have Kepler continuing the work of Brahe, although Kepler is going to argue more so for the Copernican model. Regardless, we all know the story that follows this. Galileo argues for heliocentrism. There is somewhat of a discussion that occurs with various church authorities, many of them actually astronomers. At the end of this discussion, probably for political motivations, Galileo is told to stop popularizing heliocentrism. To be fair to the church authorities at the time, there were some court intrigues going on around involving some cardinals and the Pope. This might just have been old-fashioned political spite, not actually a challenge to the role of the sciences. Regardless, Galileo is told to stop teaching heliocentrism, and at the time, the works of Copernicus are also condemned. They are placed on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the index of forbidden books. All books that were placed on that, all writings placed on that, were forbidden, hence the name, for Catholics to study or teach about. Following the condemnation of the Copernican theory, Galileo writes a dialogue between someone who believes in heliocentrism and someone who believes in geocentrism. He's supposedly following up on a request of a church authority to try and explain the two models, giving the full scientific backing for both. Somehow, in Galileo's dialogue, the figure arguing for geocentrism comes off as a moron, and somehow the figure arguing for heliocentrism looks ingenious. The church authorities monitoring Galileo recognize what's happening, and they say, hey, bud, you weren't supposed to be teaching this. And this begins a long process of review of Galileo's works. He's eventually brought before the Inquisition, and it is determined that, in fact, someone who wrote a book saying heliocentrism is true believes that heliocentrism is true. Galileo has his works condemned, they're placed on the index, and he is sentenced to imprisonment, which is later on commuted to a house arrest that lasts for the remainder of Galileo's life. How is church authority challenged here? Similar to what we saw with Bruno, Galileo is seen as attacking the church's authority to interpret the Bible. Given the closeness to the Protestant Reformation, this is especially problematic. He's also seen as attacking the dominant philosophical system, the natural scientific system of Ptolemy and Aristotle, which was held by many in the church, the scholastic thinkers of the medieval period, to be the way most consistent with biblical understandings of the world and with theological understandings of the world. But lastly, Galileo is in the interesting position of challenging the church's authority to rule on what might be read or taught upon and what might not be. We don't want to read too much into the history of what was happening, but we could at least see Galileo as a first victim of, we'll say, academic censorship. He wasn't the first, but he's probably the most recognizable to us. And it's worth mentioning that it was, in this time and also in the earlier medieval period, it was kept to the church, this power of being able to say, this ought to be read or taught, this ought to not be. Thomas Aquinas, many of you have probably heard of, he taught at the University of Paris. He's a saint and a doctor of the church. His theological works were condemned following his death for being heretical. Now, when he became a saint, mysteriously those condemnations disappeared, but it's worth mentioning that the church reserved to itself this ability to say, based on the truths of our religion, this can be taught or read and this cannot be. Two more examples. We'll cover these in a little less detail because I want to be mindful of time, but also because Galileo, again, is sort of our archetypal example of what happens when there is this conflict. John Scopes of Scopes Trial fame. He's a teacher in Tennessee, teaches a science class, teaches evolution, which violates a public law at the time in Tennessee. The Scopes trial, named after John Scopes being prosecuted by the state for violating a law with respect to what can be taught in classrooms, had nothing to do with John Scopes. It was framed as a great confrontation between creationism, the belief that God creates in the literal way described in Genesis, and evolution. Now, what exactly that great combativeness is, it's less clear. It was an opportunity for lawyers to prove themselves. It was an attempt by a figure, William Jennings Bryant, who had lost presidential elections to try and regain previous stature. There's a lot going on with the Scopes trial. The outcome of it doesn't really matter. Scopes is convicted, given a very small fine, which is later on commuted because of a technicality. What was rather important was that you saw the first challenges of what we might call state-supported religion in the United States. Now, this is not commenting on some constitutional stuff that happened earlier. We're talking about soft support here. So an institutionalization of a Christian culture, that gets attacked in the Scopes trial. The idea that in some ways the Christianity of the persons in Tennessee can determine what the state regulates in education, that was what was really brought to trial. It didn't happen for scopes. It didn't happen immediately. But most of these laws regarding the teaching of various scientific theses and restricting that teaching based on religious belief, they cease to exist. What was the challenge here in the Scopes trial? This isn't a direct challenge to the Catholic Church, obviously. There were no hidden papists demanding the Tennessee legislature do their will. Rather, the challenge here, again, there's biblical interpretative challenges, but the challenge here is about the legal authority of the church, the presence of the church within the sphere of politics. There's also an interesting theological and philosophical point to be raised. The teaching of evolution was seen as attacking the dignity of the human person. There's a big difference between saying God created all humanity and gives them a soul through his breath and saying you're related to monkeys. You came from a monkey a long time ago. And it's this theme of human dignity that actually shows up many times in these disputes. Why was the Copernican model seen as problematic? Beyond the interpretation of the Bible that it seemed to challenge, also because there's a big difference between saying you are the apex of creation, you are the final thing God made that he endowed with goodness, with dignity, and saying you live on one small planet, in one small system, in one small galaxy, in an infinite or near infinite universe of galaxies. So, to avoid framing the church as merely being reactionary, as merely being anti-science, there are legitimate concerns here that are raised in all of our examples. We'll get to the final example briefly, but it's worth mentioning. There are these thoughts we talked about earlier. Is science encroaching on what should be the realm of religion by making comments about the God-given, for the Christian, attribute of dignity or worth or human value? There is going to be this, what shall we call it, this push and pull between religion and science. And in these challenges to the church's authority to weigh in on, so to speak, these various controversies, we see a lot of pulling of things away from the church. It's unfair merely to characterize the church that killed Bruno, that imprisoned Galileo, that led to persons enacting laws that forbade the teaching of evolution in state schools. It's unfair to say that is the only thing the church has ever been. Remember the litany of all of our modern scientists who were both religious and also some of the greatest minds their fields have ever seen. If there isn't a Newton, we don't have modern physics. If there isn't a Boyle, if there isn't a Leibniz, if there isn't a Bacon, again, countless luminaries in the sciences that we have today that are taught across the street, if not for Christian thinkers, they don't exist. What our challenge is, it's not shut up all the religious people. I think that would be somewhat offensive to my audience tonight. It's to figure out when we get to speak as religious persons, when we get to speak as empirically minded persons, and when, as Wittgenstein put it, we ought to remain silent, for we do not know. The central challenges presented here have to do with the question of when religion has that knowledge that allows it to speak, and when science has that knowledge, and whether those two ever intersect. One last example, which I chose because of its recency, of its relevance. COVID happened a little bit ago, and if you remember, the creation of a vaccine for COVID was the turning point, so to speak, in our ability to prevent not just infections, but also deaths. Most of the major COVID vaccines, at least those available in the West, were based on mRNA treatments. I shouldn't say treatments, that's the wrong word. Were based on formulation using manipulation of mRNA. There were other forms of the vaccine, though. We saw this with the Chinese and Russian vaccines that were based on what's called an adenovirus. Basically, you take a virus that can't infect you, and you stick it in someone's body, and then their body learns to recognize that virus, so if it sees it again, the immune system can attack it. If any of you do medicine, please forgive me for my horrible explanation of that. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which became available in the United States, functions like that latter kind. Okay? So why are we talking about this in a conversation about religion and about science? Because there was immense worry about the use of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine by Christians because of its relationship to an aborted fetus. Back in the 60s or 70s, I believe it's in the 70s, a fetus was aborted. That's all we know about this particular fetus. Cell lines were created by drawing biological material from the fetus, basically by taking parts of the fetus out. These cell lines were used for research. Cell lines are actually cloned fairly regularly because they degrade over time. Think about it this way. You get dry skin on your body, you brush the dry skin off, there's new skin. There's an aging process for any cell in the body. Similarly, cell lines will also age. So the cloning of the cell lines is done so that they can be used continuously. There was a connection between the abortion of this fetus decades ago and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, used both in research toward the vaccine and then also in the production of it, was a cell line that historically traced back to that aborted fetus. And so the worry of many Christians was that there was a moral violation of that fetus and that the use of a cell line derived from it would involve cooperation in that immoral action, cooperation in the evil of abortion. Why do I bring this up as an example of the conflict between faith and religion? Well, because there's a very obvious conflict here. If you're an epidemiologist, you say, well, there's availability of this vaccine, it only requires 1 dose instead of 2, everyone should go get it. If you're a religious person, you might feel a little tentative. Well, I'm not sure I should, because of its connection to abortion. Now, there's a bunch of moral theology that we can do that would lead us to the conclusion it is in fact moral, it is in fact not just morally permitted, but it is morally obligatory to receive an available vaccine, including the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. But that conflict is one of the type that isn't easily resolvable. This isn't just religion talking about interpreting the Bible. This isn't just the scientists relaying lab results. They both have a legitimate claim to the question presented. How ought we react to a once-in-a-generation pandemic? How ought we treat persons who are going to be possible victims of this pandemic? And how do we still hold ourselves true to the values that we have, not just as religious persons, but as human persons that care about each other in general? This is an example where we don't have an easy solution, where we can't just say, go to that roommate's room or go to that roommate's room. It's this example, though, that I think is going to be most instructive moving forward. So the last question I want to pose to you, can religion and science be friends? It sounds childish, sophomoric, but I don't think it is. Can they get along? Is there consistency there? Well, let's look back at our apartment model. Did the challenges to the church's authority presented by Bruno, presented by Galileo, presented by Scopes, and so many others undermine the fundamental aim of the church? In Luke's gospel, we heard it this past Thursday, I think, the ascension narrative. Go therefore and baptize all nations in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, the Great Commission. Did Bruno's work prevent that from occurring? Did Galileo's? Did the challenges to the church's authority undermine the church's aim with respect to understanding the world? No, because the church has a legitimate interest in truth, into knowing the world as it is. Is science better suited to answering empirical questions than religion? For most empirical questions, the answer seems to be yes. Insofar as we have reliable ways of figuring out what's happening in the world and predicting future occurrences in the world, we should rely on those. Science does a pretty good job with that. So, given all of this, it seems like our conclusion should be there's a very teeny space for the theologian to operate in, and everything else is up to science. That's not the conclusion that I want to argue for. When we talk about religion and science being friendly with each other, it's not just a question of resolving this distinction or this difference between competing authorities. Yes, the church was able to do the work that Jesus entrusted her with, despite Galileo saying that there was empirical evidence that the sun did not revolve around the earth. And yes, the church still had an interest in knowing the world in an accurate way, regardless of a hundreds-year-old dispute with a couple different Italians. And yes, while there are going to be spaces where the empirical sciences do far better than the church, that doesn't mean those are all of the spaces that are in the world. So, can they be friends? Well, that depends. On what? Well, are the past failures of the church predictive and causative? Do they tell us that every time science and religion come into contact, they will be fighting with each other? And do they tell us that there's something about how science works and how the church works that requires them to forever be warring with each other? The Muslim philosopher, theologian, scientist, legal scholar, Ibn Rushd, famously says, and it's a line that's later on adopted by Thomas Aquinas, truth does not contradict truth. Can religion and science be friends? If they're aiming both, like we said they were earlier, like we agreed they were earlier, at discovering what is in the world, what is real, then yes, they can be. Because as Ibn Rushd pointed out, if I discover, through the use of our human faculties, of reason, of the senses, something about the world, I'm not going to find something different for him in the Quran, for us in the Bible, if I properly read it. If we understand God's revelation well, and if we understand how that revelation has been interpreted by the great minds of the Christian tradition well, and if we also understand what science can tell us about our world based on our observational abilities well, we're going to find they don't actually conflict, which may seem weird given the stories that we've just ran over. We had case studies of that conflict. There are many others I didn't mention tonight, so how can we say there isn't in fact a conflict? How can we say truth doesn't contradict truth, besides just saying religion has no special claim to truth, besides brushing it aside in the form of, in favor of some form of scientism? Well, it goes back to a question of methodology. Earlier I said that, well, science can do what it does and religion can do what it does, and that's okay because they're both aiming at truth. But you deserved a little bit fuller of an answer there. There are different ways of being a religious person approaching questions about the observable world. If you are one of the inquisitors that challenged Bruno, that tried Bruno, that challenged Galileo, that tried Galileo, because you thought the Genesis story could only be read literally, that's a failure of the theologian, of the religious person. If, on the other hand, you were Tycho Brahe and you challenged Galileo, while he did have some comments about the religious implications of Galileo's theory, if you challenged him because you thought that there was data that suggested he was wrong, that was a Christian person with Christian motivations doing good scientific work. I don't think we should condemn that just because Brahe happened to go, I was going to say to Mass, but he was probably Protestant, so to services. Just because a religious person says something that's properly scientific, that doesn't make it inadmissible. Because religious persons can do good scientific work. The lesson here, I think, about these past failures is one not about the fact that they were Christians that failed. It's rather about the kind of Christian that these persons were. There are still those Christians with us today. Not to besmirch his name or to unfairly single him out, but Ken Ham is an example of this kind of Christian. We can call them fundamentalists, not a word I stole from someone who's sitting here tonight. The kind of Christian who says we have to read the Bible this way and only this way. The kind of Catholic who says we have to read what the popes, what the bishops said in this way and only this way. We can fill in more kinds of fundamentalism. The point is, if we want to carve out space for the religious person in the world of the scientist, we have to make sure that we as persons who inhabit the religious world allow that same thing. We can't look at the Genesis story and say all the scientists in the world must be wrong because Moses tells us so. If we're going to make careful study of the world a priority, truth about the world a priority, we have to turn inwards and make that priority within our own religion. Augustine himself argued for, Origen argued for, interpretations of the Bible that went beyond the literal, and somehow that got lost. Thomas was the great synthesizer of the pagan Greek philosophies, of the Muslim commentaries on the pagan Greek philosophies, and of the Catholic tradition. And yet, Thomas was condemned as being a heretical Averroist. The point is, we have great figures in the Christian tradition who did the very real work of saying, I believe in the Catholic faith, in various Christian faiths. And yet I also believe that there are things outside of my faith that can reinforce what I believe for religious reasons. There are figures that are also able to say, I recognize this thing over here helps me better understand the world. And given the resources available in my tradition, I'm going to try and bring that thing in rather than shut that thing out. So, the failures of the past were not failures of religion writ large. They were failures of, unfortunately, small-minded religious persons who decided that their way of understanding God was the best and could not be taken away from them and could not be something that they could be persuaded away from. Father Pat has said to me numerous times, usually when chiding me about thinking about things too much and being too philosophical, that God is bigger than any one person's imagination. So, given that, the conflict might go away if we stop trying to limit where God can be in the world. I'd like to close with one last, hopefully, optimistic reflection. A new horizon for understanding religion and science as being interactive. In his critique of practical reason, the great German modern philosopher Immanuel Kant writes this: "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing wonder and reverence, the more often and steadily one reflects on them: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me." Go outside. Find a place where there's not street lights, there's not house lights, and look up. The wonder that Kant felt 200 years ago, we can still feel today. And that wonder is what happens when we do science rightly. When we see the world truly. That wonder sounds an awful like that religious experience that James talks about. I'm guessing that wonder is something many of you have felt with respect to religion. Again, the aims are the same: understanding reality and then marveling at it. Given this, we should not conclude there is any fundamental conflict. Instead, what we should aim at is Kant's reaction to the stars in the heavens above. we do the work, we learn what is true, and then we feel wonder in understanding that. Thank you. So since we only have one operational microphone, I'll take questions now, ask the question, and then I'll just repeat it for our audience, which is streaming.
Does it work?
Oh my gosh, it works.
Yes, it does. So this is just so timely. This discussion for me is just so timely. I've never quite had an issue with gelling the concept of science and God. That to me, that's never really clashed. However, in my head, truth is there. And we get closer to the truth the more we know, the more, as you explained, Einstein took what we knew and got us closer to the truth. But today, when I watch the news, there is alternative facts and truth that's on all the different stations. And I'm looking and I'm thinking, there is a truth out there. And it seems that now people choose their truth. And if you can't necessarily get to a truth. That's all.
If you're asking me what the solution to that is, I have no idea.
But there is a truth. There is truth.
So the question you're bringing up is what broadly we can call epistemic realism or epistemic prescriptivism, which I'll explain in this way. If you think some beliefs are bad, you're an epistemic realist or prescriptivist. There's differences that involve decades of argument that I don't really care about for the purposes of this talk. If you think that people can be wrong about what they believe, or people can have bad reasons for what they believe, you ultimately think that there are true things in the world and there are false things. There might be convincing arguments against this kind of realism, but as Aristotle tells us in the Metaphysics, if you talk to someone who doesn't think that two things can't both be true at the same time, you should just stop talking to them. If you talk to someone who says a horse is a horse, but also not a horse, you're not going to get very far. Which ultimately means, I think, everyone, if you press them, is going to be an epistemic realist, is going to think something is true. Now, this idea of my truth or your truth, it has a foundation that I think is worth interacting with. So we can talk about the postmodernist movement. They challenge the scientific advances of the modern period by noting that those scientific advancements were often based in historical oppression and really awful attitudes taken towards people who weren't European. We can accept that there are true things in the world and also accept that our ways of knowing that they're true are flawed. And I think that is the most charitable understanding of postmodernism. We can say, yes, we still think there's something true, but it's really hard to get to, and we probably shouldn't just assume that we're the ones who got the right method already.
So my point I'd like to put out is that I know a lot of the times we say the church said or took a certain position on things. I think a lot of people think that whenever the church speaks, it's speaking infallibly, and it's not. There's a very small area where it's speaking infallibly, and a very large area where it's providing opinion. I wondered if you comment on that.
So what Mike's talking about is known as grades of theological certainty. That's probably not a term you've ever heard. Basically, there are levels of church teaching. Some of that teaching is binding for every single Catholic. As an example, if you don't think Jesus is God, that's a little bit more important than a view that you might take on bodily augmentation for someone who has a healthy organ that they're attempting to replace. This is part of transhumanism. There's a difference between those two with respect to you being a good Catholic or being a Catholic in union with the church. So, as Mike said, the stuff up here in this category of really, really important, there's not very much of it compared to the stuff that comes underneath it. And where does the sciencey stuff fall? Well, Robert Bellarmine was first never pope. He never ran a general council. I mentioned him because he's one of the major figures in the Inquisition in the era of Bruno and Galileo. Bellarmine wasn't doing that kind of work. We're not required today to look back and say, well, they burned Bruno, so I guess we should think that there's no aliens. No. Bellarmine may have been acting as an authority within the church, but that doesn't mean he was speaking with the authority of the church. And most pronouncements made on science, if not all pronouncements made by the church on science, they're correctable. They're not said in the same way as what we would say about God, about Mary, which is actually I think it's the only instance, right, Mike, of the Pope speaking infallibly? So Mike laid out the process for a pope to actually speak infallibly, and I think what's really worth pulling out of what was just said, it requires the pope to speak on faith and morals. Remember we talked about the roommates having their different spaces? That is definitively the space the church still claims for herself. But that means there's a lot of space outside of that room that is left up to, maybe not us as individuals, we should probably still listen to the physicists when we're talking about physics, but it is not definitively spoken on by the church in the exercise of her teaching authority granted to her by God.
I just wanted to follow up on what Mike said, and I might meander a little bit here. Where does free will come into play in this? Because, obviously we have a belief system, and when we have free will to believe certain things, we cannot believe them. Within the current church, even today, there's people that believe different things that are in leadership positions and they don't agree. We can go back into history and I think it was Pope Clement VII who actually agreed with the Copernican theory of the sun being at the center 100 years before the trials of Galileo Galilei, right? So there's been a lot of disagreement both in a time frame of hundreds of years and also in just one point in time. And, I believe in science. I mean, I always, look to the science, but science sometimes is wrong too. Sometimes we do a study, we find something out, and we do another study, we find something different. So we have the power of free will. We were given that. That's a God-given gift. But as you know, that could be good. It can also be not so good. Where does free will play into all this?
So there's two things I want to say, and the question is well taken because I think it's really important to talk about where individual belief fits in with this entire discussion. Because ultimately, none of us have a direct line to the papacy built into our heads. It's not like there's this magical telegraph where the Pope taps out something and it shows up in the head of every Catholic. That's not how this works. All of us come to believe in something through a fairly similar process. We hear something, we think it over and go, well, that makes sense because of this, or I don't like that because of this. So when we're talking about individual beliefs with respect to something that has religious import or has scientific import, the process doesn't change. So how then should we be using this process, or more properly, what's the best way to apply this process of our being able to choose, I believe or I don't believe? In many ways, I think this process is best understood using a different model. What is that model? Let's say I put a swimming pool in your backyard. And I put some fish into the swimming pool. Fish that look suspiciously like piranhas. And I tell you, oh, it's fine. Go swimming, you'll enjoy it. And you look again and they really look like piranhas. No, jump in. Are you sure? I pulled up on my phone a picture of a piranha. I also just happened to drop a mutton chop in there and the water churned and all the meat was gone in a couple seconds. No, they're not piranha. Would you jump in the pool? when it comes to our beliefs, I think we have a similar responsibility. We shouldn't just jump in the pool of piranhas because somebody told us they're not piranhas. We have a duty to inform ourselves. In philosophy, we call this justifying belief. So you can believe whatever you want. That doesn't make it a good belief. So this goes back to what Mary was asking about. You can think something's true. That doesn't mean you're right about it. So our duty then, and I use that word purposefully, because this is something that matters. This is something we should be trying to do. Our duty, whether we're asking about the moral use of a particular vaccine, whether we're asking about long-term effects of teaching creationism in classrooms, whatever the question might be, we should figure out the relevant reasons behind the various beliefs and select the belief that is most reasonable, most rational. But there's one other thing worth mentioning. Our choice of beliefs, it's not a one-time choice. It's not like we say, I think this, and then we can't change it. There's another duty involved. If we have reason to think something we believe is not accurate, does not fit the world, describe the world as well as it could, we should reevaluate that belief. If we're presented with evidence that seems to falsify, that seems to be against something we believe, we should change the belief. So, yeah, there is good and bad to any exercise, any free exercise of our will. But if we're free to exercise it, that means we can make up for mistakes. I can choose better beliefs, and then I can also correct the beliefs that I hold if I need to. One other thing I wanted to mention was this idea of consensus. So not every scientist agrees on everything. Not every theologian or faith tradition agrees on everything. I think the thing that we need to follow here is, well, consensus. If you have the one bishop down in Texas who says, don't take the vaccine, or one bishop who says if you vote for Democrats, you're going to hell, maybe don't pay attention to that bishop. If you have the one scientist who says climate change isn't real, who says vaccines cause autism, so Wakefield is the perfect example for vaccines cause autism, formerly a doctor, he's since lost his medical license, published a study showing that there is a link between the MMR vaccine and autism. There have been numerous meta-studies, numerous competing studies, pretty much all the gatherings of evidence that you could ask for, disproving Wakefield's claim. This isn't some nefarious exercise of conspiring pharmaceutical giants. This isn't some political correctness among scientists. There's evidence, and evidence, and evidence, and evidence showing that Wakefield's claim is not accurate, it's not correct. So I think there what we're looking for when we have disagreement of authorities, which absolutely happens within the church, well, let's go back 1,000 years. Let's see how, good old Tommy Aquinas is doing. Let's see how Anselm's doing. Let's see how Augustine's doing. And then look today as well at the faith leaders we have and the theologians we have. If they're all coming together in a similar area, probably should weigh that more than the one bishop saying the one really stupid thing. All right, well, thank you all of you for your time tonight.